Good afternoon and welcome to Middle East in Focus. I'm Nagwa Ibrahim. When Egyptians rose up against Hosni Mubarak in 2011, many believed, including myself, that we were witnessing the end of a dictatorship. 15 years later, according to Hossam el-Hamalawy, journalist and scholar, what followed wasn't simply a return to the old regime, but something harsher, more centralized, and more ambitious in its violence. A new order entirely. Hossam el-Hamalawy is a journalist, scholar, and activist who has spent years researching Egypt's military and security services. He was among the organizers of the 2011 uprising and has long been in the labor movement and the fight against police brutality in Egypt. His new book is Counterrevolution in Egypt, Sisi's New Republic, and he joins us now to talk about how President Sisi rose to power and the new style of dictatorship that he's built. Welcome, Hossam el-Hamalawy, to Middle East in Focus.
Ahlan, Nagwa. It's a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.
I have been wanting to do a show about this very topic for a long time, so I am really, really grateful for your work and to have you on the show today. Let's jump right in because I have so many questions. Okay, so your new book, Counter-Revolution in Egypt, Sisi's New Republic, draws on both research and lived experience. Could you share that lived experience and why you felt it was important to write this book?
Sure. First, I must clarify that the manuscript for the book, more or less, was produced when I was doing my PhD in political science here in Berlin, but it draws on roughly 2 decades of activism and research and scholar work, as well as first-hand experiences that I went through in Egypt. I was born in Cairo, raised in Cairo, lived most of my life in Cairo till I had to leave it in 2015 amid the crackdown on the revolutionary forces following the military coup, which we will talk about, I'm sure, in details. But the book basically is trying to dissect the Sisi regime. There had been so many debates and arguments in the activist community in Egypt and among the international left about the nature of the Sisi dictatorship. And in the beginning, many people were describing the horror that was happening in the country as a return to the Mubarak order. And in the book, as well as I'm trying to dissect that security apparatus, but I'm trying to argue that a victorious counter-revolution does not restore the old order simply because the old order has failed. Hence, the counter-revolutionaries, they avoid the mistakes of the past. They try to perfect a new regime that would be even more repressive in order to avoid the problem or the catastrophe of facing another revolution. The lived experiences, which some of them were mentioned in the book, included my long-time activism within the socialist left in Egypt. I joined the underground left by the end of the 1990s. I was then an undergraduate student at the height of Hosni Mubarak's war on terror. I've been detained and tortured by state security police in the year 2000. And then arrested several times later due to my involvement in the labor movement and in the fight against police brutality, as well as my organizing efforts. So there are several things in that book which I give testimonies on, and I try to engage with the narratives around 2011 and what happened later.
And you were part of the organizers that were organizing, and I know that it was, many different groups and organizers for the 2011 revolution. But you were part of some of the organizing. Is that right?
It's true. Since 1998, I've been a member of the Egyptian Revolutionary Socialists, which is the biggest organization in the Egyptian revolutionary left. And we were part of the organizing efforts in Tahrir in the run-up to the revolution and then later.
Okay, yeah. So now I want to get into the 2011 revolution. And I will say, something I mentioned in the opening, I'm Egyptian living here in the United States, but and have been back and forth to Egypt a lot and was actively engaged watching from here the revolution in Egypt that was happening in 2011. It was so inspiring. I'd wish that I was there in the streets while it was happening too. And I think, as I mentioned in the opening, people were witnessing it both in Egypt and around the world. Everyone felt very strongly that we were witnessing the end of a dictatorship, and it was just incredible to be a part of that history and to be watching it unfold. So we're going to get into the aftermath of that, but before we do that, for those who might not know, or for listeners who may not recall, can you summarize the 2011 Egyptian revolution and what it challenged about the Mubarak regime and how the Mubarak regime responded?
Sure. Hosni Mubarak is a former military general who has been ruling the country at the time since 1981. Following the assassination of his predecessor, Anwar Sadat. And Hosni Mubarak was pro-American, was part of the Pax Americana in the region. During his tenure, Egypt was the second largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid after Israel. The Egyptian military, more or less, was an auxiliary force for the Americans. And in 1991, three important things happened. First was the Egyptian participation in the Gulf War against Iraq. Secondly, Mubarak started a war on terror, which was, which was a dirty war, Latin American style, in the same horrific stories that you read about the counterinsurgency in Latin America in the 1970s and 80s. These were the same tactics applied by the regime, first against the Islamist opposition, but then, as the case always with these kind of wars, whether it's a war on terror, war on drugs, war on crime, they extend the net and they expand it to include all shades of dissent. The third important thing, Nagwa, and this is what I'm trying to highlight also in the book, because many analysts tend to ignore that, the war on terror was launched hand in hand with the neoliberal transition in Egypt. 1991 was also the start of the ERTAP, the Economic Reform and Structural Adjustment Program, under the sponsorship of the IMF and the World Bank. And if you look not just in Egypt, but around the world, you'll always find austerity policies and neoliberalism. They always go hand in hand with such wars. Mubarak ruled by terror, by state terror. He had an infamous interior minister, Habib al-Adli, who was the longest serving interior minister in the history of modern Egypt. But around the time when I joined the dissident movement in Egypt, you could not whisper Hosni Mubarak's name. He was a huge taboo. But thanks to the second Palestinian Intifada, it threw a rock in still water. The Palestinian cause has always been a big radicalizing and politicizing factor for Egyptian youth. And many of the leaders and the organizers in the uprising, we all came from the pro-Palestine or the Palestine Solidarity movement. Because simply Egyptians and Arabs, they take to the streets in solidarity with the Palestinians, but then they start questioning their local regime's stance towards the Palestinian cause. And then they start generalizing about their own experiences. And that's how dissent usually brews. So from the pro-Palestine protests in the year 2000, it metamorphosed into the anti-Iraq war protest. And then a chain reaction continued over a decade, whereby militancy was spilling over to all sectors of Egyptian society, most notably the working class. And that paved the road to the 2011 uprising. Usually people in the West and even in Egypt, they look at 2011 as a separate event. But actually it was preceded by an entire decade of struggles, whereby the taboo of Hosni Mubarak was being brought down bit by bit, brick by brick, where Egyptians were engaging in small fights here and there and gaining experience and gaining confidence on how to organize against the state. So when, again, the issue of police brutality triggered the uprising, it was an all-out war against the police. And that's how the revolution started.
And, you know, for those who don't know, with respect to Mubarak's regime, one of the things that I always thought, you know, was interesting and needed to be pointed out and talked about was how the Mubarak regime often tried to position itself as if it was a democratic government and as if it was, in fact, having democratic elections, but that was not the case. So could you touch upon that and how, and we'll get into now how we see that with Sisi, but how that it was truly a dictatorship, even though it was trying to present itself as if it was a democratic government or a democracy?
We did have elections, but they were engineered more or less. And the opposition, you knew in advance how many seats, for example, the opposition will take. And this was part of a bargain between the Hosni Mubarak regime and his security services and the different opposition groups. So there was some ecosystem designed to diffuse dissent. But having said that, Hosni Mubarak was the law. The first 2 decades of his rule, you could not voice any form of opposition or dissent or critique against him or his family. Hosni Mubarak ruled primarily using state security police, which is our version of the FBI. And they resort to basically torture dungeons and state terror in order to subjugate the population. In the 1990s, at the height of the war on terror, industrial actions were met with live ammunition. And the police special forces used to break into factories to suspend those strikes by force. Student activism was limited to the campuses up until at least the Second Palestinian Intifada. And the moment you set your foot outside the street, you were risking literally being shot. There were no independent trade unions in Egypt. They were all more or less nationalized by the Nasser regime back in 1957. But they continued under Mubarak, whereby you had security-friendly bureaucrats claiming to represent the workers, but actually they were being used in order to police the workplaces. And there was no room for independent organizing. Hence, the ensuing strikes, which started in the years in the run-up to the revolution, they were mainly strikes by unofficial organizers who, on the one hand, they would be striking against the state, and during negotiations, they would be negotiating with both the management, state security police, and their state-backed union officials. So this is roughly more or less the picture. However, Nagwa, Hosni Mubarak used to get away with so much of such rubbish because the Western media used to label his regime, together with Jordan and together with Saudi Arabia, as moderate Arab regimes, because the barometer for moderation depended on the proximity to U.S. Foreign policy. So if you are pro-U.S., then you're a moderate regime. If you're anti-U.S., then you are a rogue state like Al-Assad Syria or Saddam's, Iraq. But those same dictators who used to carry out very similar policies to them, they were regarded as moderates. Hence, you will find this kind of whitewashing of Hosni Mubarak's crimes in the run-up to the revolution in Western media.
And we will definitely get into, towards the end of this segment, about U.S. foreign policy and how it actually supported both the Mubarak dictatorship as well as the current Sisi dictatorship. So we will definitely get more into that. I want to turn now to post-2011 revolution and something that you point out about how the army was not pro-revolution. And I think this is so important to talk about because the common belief was that that the army was somehow pro-revolution. Can you talk about how the army actually stepped in to save the state rather than the uprising and the revolution? And how did the idea that the army was pro-revolution take hold and become widely accepted?
The army was kind of shielded from criticism under Mubarak because the army took the back seat when it came to running the country. Meaning, yes, they were the most important institution, the most influential institution. Their power and influence were everywhere. But in the forefront and during the daily interaction with the citizens, it was mainly the police and the political apparatus of Hosni Mubarak. Hence, Egyptians did not experience first-hand repression at the hands of the army under Mubarak. Everyone knew conscription was a rotten deal. Everyone knew that, at least a year or 3 years of your life will be wasted as a conscript in the army. But once you're done with that, you go on with your life and you don't worry that much about it. So when the army intervened and was deployed to the streets on the 28th of January, following the collapse of the regime, unlike the narrative that was spun later by the military did not expect the uprising, because I also discussed this in details in my book. Sisi tried to spin a narrative that he predicted that an uprising will take place and warned the senior brass at least a year in advance. And the army was not marginalized under Mubarak, because this is also another narrative that some pundits have been arguing for in order to try to explain why the army gave up on Mubarak and helped depose him. Thirdly, the military from its start could not repress the uprising simply because they were taken back by what's happening, and they could not depend on the loyalty of their conscripts if they were given the order to shoot. The Egyptian military, in case your listeners didn't know, is largely based on conscription. And among some elite units, these elite units would be the special forces, the paratroopers. You still find conscripts, but these units are usually in a much more able position to carry out the repression because they are very coherent, they are easily deployed, they are fast, and they are staunchly pro-regime. So they would be efficient in suppressing small riots if the police fails to do so. But in the face of a mass national uprising engulfing the country, especially its northern provinces, the military had to deploy chunks of its troops, and they could not depend on or trust their loyalty. Among my sources that I interviewed for the book was a conscript who told me that during the first 24 hours of his deployment with the mechanized brigade that was sent to pacify and control the eastern part of the Nile Delta, they did not issue ammunition for them. So they were moving around the first 24 hours with basically Kalashnikovs that didn't have any ammo. And it's simply because the generals could not trust them. And they were afraid that if they send in such mass number of troops into the streets with ammunition, that they will join the protesters and start shooting both at the police and at their senior brass. I do engage with other narratives also that depicts the army as itching to take power from the 11th of February 2011, the day that Mubarak was impeached. And actually, I'm arguing that the army did not plan for this at the beginning. And instead, they were hoping to return to the barracks as soon as possible and get some civilian politician in the forefront in order to defuse the situation. And hence came their Faustian bargain with the Islamists.
Coming to you from the studios of listener-supported KPFK in Los Angeles, this is Middle East in Focus. I'm Nagwa Ibrahim, and we are talking about how President Sisi has built a new style of dictatorship in Egypt with our guest, journalist, scholar, and activist Hossam el-Hamalawy, author of Counterrevolution in Egypt, Sisi's New Republic. Okay, let's now get into, and I know we're getting close to time, so I want to make sure we get everything in as much as possible. I want to get into the Muslim Brotherhood now. And in the aftermath of 2011, you say that the Muslim Brotherhood inherited political office, but not actual rule. What do you mean by that distinction?
The military was itching from the start to return to the barracks, but the military wanted a swift end to the revolution. There were so many conspiracy theory narratives at the time about how the army is Islamized, hence they are giving the country up to the Islamists, how Sisi was a Muslim Brotherhood in the closet, and there was so much garbage being said at the time. But the fact that the Islamists, and especially the Muslim Brotherhood, they were the most organized among the factions that took part in the uprising. And also they were the most reformist. Reformist here, I don't mean it in a positive sense, meaning that they were happy to work with the current state in order to bring back law and order, just with some cosmetic changes. So the Muslim Brotherhood were willing to play the game with the military, and in exchange, the military was okay with giving them a share and inviting them to join the ruling coalition. But simply the Islamists failed. They failed at the main point of that Faustian bargain, which is they could not contain the streets. Back to what you were saying, did they inherit the state or just inherited the office? They wanted to keep the state as it is, with few cosmetic changes, and thinking that if they seduce the old order, they could actually stay in power. But there is a famous saying, those who carry out half a revolution, or those who make half a revolution, they dig their own graves. There are really, it's a zero-sum game in your war with the old regime. You've seen this in Egypt, you've seen this in Tunisia, which was championed as a model of success and moderation and what have you. No, the old order would return with vengeance. And that's what happened with the Islamists.
And actually, I was in Egypt when, as you point out, the Muslim Brotherhood could not contain the streets. I mean, there were, millions of people in the streets protesting against the Muslim Brotherhood, once again trying to ensure that there is, in fact, that revolution isn't just a half revolution, that in fact what is seen in government and in Egypt was really honoring the revolutionary spirit in the streets. And I saw that for myself when I was there. But then what actually comes after the Muslim Brotherhood is taken out of office is just this new order under Sisi that is a new style of dictatorship. And now I want to get to that. And you argue that Sisi's rise wasn't just another reshuffling of power. It was a fundamental structural shift, and that after 2011, the state's greatest fear was no longer a coup from within, but rather the people themselves. Okay, that's an incredibly powerful statement that you're making. Can you elaborate on this structural shift, what it looks like in practice, and how Sisi's dictatorship differs from Mubarak's?
Sisi likes to describe his regime as the Second Republic, which he says was born in 2013. Now, the First Republic was born in 1953, 1 year after the Free Officers' Coup. And in case your listeners didn't know, these were an eclectic group of nationalist army officers who overthrew the British-backed monarchy and created the Republic. But since they came to power through a coup, so their immediate concerns, which became the concern for the successive presidents all the way up to 2011, was the threat of a military coup. At the time, it was there was a spate of military coups happening all over the global south. Many regarded the army as the vehicle for the intervention of the middle classes in politics, and regarded the military as a revolutionary force that could drive the development of the country and rid it of colonialism and what have you. So the security apparatus in Egypt, even when it was fearful, it was fragmented. Each institution, whether it's the military or the police or the general intelligence service, or which we call in Arabic the mukhabarat, they all had overlapping mandates. They hardly coordinated with one another. They monitored and surveilled one another. They were in a competition. They were fighting over resources, so that only the president would have the bird's eye view of what's happening and coup-proof himself. And they never took us seriously. I mean here, as Egyptians, they never took us seriously. They knew that we could maybe carry out few protests here and there, some riots here and there, but Egyptians, in their eyes, did not have the agency to organize something like 2011, which is a colonial, degrading kind of view that they inherited from the colonial powers. And I argue in my book that the modern Egyptian state, it's behaving like a colonial state, but without colonizers. Now, 2011 happened, and for roughly 2.5 years, the Egyptian elites, mainly the senior brass, they watched in horror as Egyptian ordinary people were on the streets trying to build a new order, trying to create a different world from the one that they were living at. And they saw the gallows hanging in front of their eyes. And that's when the generals decided to intervene and pacify the streets themselves once and for all. They had tried the Islamists to do that job, and the Islamists failed. So the generals, and that includes Sisi and his comrades, decided to do that job themselves. Hence, the sheer level of bloodshed and brutality that we saw in the coup. And it was brutality that was aired live, Nagwa. Most of these massacres and crackdowns, including the infamous Rabaa massacre, these were aired on TV because simply the new regime, the Second Republic, was being born, and the message to the Egyptian people that any form of collective action in public spaces is not welcome. It's over. Hence, the new regime that rose on the ruins of the First Republic, it's a regime that knows no compromise. It's a regime, Hosni Mubarak used to manage dissent. Sisi eradicates dissent. It's a regime where there is no civil society. Even when Mubarak was an authoritarian dictator, but there was a vibrant civil society. And in so many ways, it did protect the state, acting as a buffer between the state and the people. So it was a double-edged sword, more or less. No, Sisi and his comrades, they regarded this as one of the reasons for the revolt. So Sisi demolished completely all civil society organizations. And instead, the daily policing of Egyptian society is being conducted by the repressive state apparatus, by the military, by the police, and by the General Intelligence Service, without a ruling national democratic party that existed under Mubarak. We have a sham parliament, but that no one really takes seriously. Without any civilian institutions, it's the repressive state apparatus basically micromanaging society.
We're going to have to bring you back because I have so many more questions, but we're running out of time.
I would love to.
Yeah, we'll definitely bring you back. I just have one last question, and if you could try to get to this maybe in just 1 minute. You acknowledge that parts of the story regarding the collapse of the Egyptian revolution blame familiar culprits like foreign meddling, but you emphasize that's not the whole truth. Why do you think it's important to recognize the broader picture? And what, if any, has been the impact of U.S. foreign policy on undermining revolutionary efforts in Egypt?
The failure of the Egyptian revolution first had to do with the fact that the participants in that revolution, most of the dissident groups, they were all trying to seduce the old state to be on their side instead of confronting the old state. And by confronting here, I don't mean to carry up arms and start shooting the police and the military, because that would be suicidal. But the fact that we should ask the conscripts to mutineer, we should push for the initiatives from below to democratize the workplaces. And there were already so many instances where you could see potential, and that's where things were going. You could have thrown your lot within the labor strikes instead of denouncing them as some counter-revolutionary sabotage for the political process. That's what the liberals and the Islamists did. As well as sections of the left. Also, there was the wrong lines of polarization. The left in Egypt, which is also highly Islamophobic in so many ways, pushed for a kind of polarization along Islamist secular lines. And once you start polarizing the country along these lines, this means you're inviting the old regime elements who were secular into the new coalitions and normalizing their presence. So there were so many internal failures in our camp, in the revolution's camp, to start with. But that doesn't absolve foreign powers. This coup would not have succeeded without the backing of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who were spearheading the counter-revolution and financed more or less the coup. This coup would not have happened also without American support, which could come as a surprise for some, since there were few sanctions and few denunciations from Obama in the beginning. But the generals were dealing with another America. The ones who are really in charge of the Egypt file, they are the Pentagon, not those miserable officials at the embassy in Cairo. So in so many ways, such foreign support enabled and encouraged the regime to crush the opposition, crush the revolution, and create this new order. Now, Sisi, despite the economic failures, he keeps on getting bailed out, both by the West and by the Gulf regimes. Why is that? Because Egypt is too big to fail. For how long this will continue, no one knows, but we are at a very, very, very bad situation when it comes to the economy in Egypt. And I think that would be also the Achilles heels for this regime. The regime is the victim of its own success, meaning it succeeded in stifling all forms of dissent. But it is these forms of dissent which also used to give breathing life for the state whenever a revolutionary upheaval takes place. So, in the end, I do invite your readers to read, your listeners to read the book. And I hope that they engage with it and recommend it. And let's have another talk about it.
We have been talking with Hossam el-Hamalawy, author of Counterrevolution in Egypt, Sisi's New Republic. And we've been talking about how President Sisi has built a new style of dictatorship. Thank you so much, Hossam el-Hamalawy, for joining us today.
Thanks, Nagwa.